Good afternoon, and welcome to another Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. It is my pleasure to welcome you. Before we get started, I want to go over a few logistical items here. We do not accept verbal questions, but we definitely want to address your questions to our presenter today. So if you hover your mouse in the bottom of your screen, you see a Q&A button there. If you push that button, a little pop-up or a little window will come up and you can type your question there. You can type your question at any time during the talk or after. We will go over as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. And if we have too many questions, we will ask our presenter to answer the questions offline and then post them together with a recording of his presentation on our website, Research in Action at Florida Atlantic's Division of Research. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Thomas Stollar. Thomas is currently Assistant Professor of Ceramics at Florida Atlantic University. And interestingly enough, he holds a PhD in ceramics from the University of Sunderland in the UK and a Master's of Fine Arts from West Virginia University. He also recently created an online exhibition called Distant Ceramics that addresses the problems that artists face in the current pandemic when we cannot meet face-to-face. And with that, I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about how art can help in these unprecedented times. Dr. Stollar.
And specifically, I teach in ceramics. So today I'd like to talk about, firstly, my motivations for being here. Next, the importance of my teaching on my life and work. I also want to talk about a little bit of my past research just as a way to kind of segue us into my current research. And I have a feeling there will probably be some random ideas and hopefully not too many of those. So my interest in doing this talk really sprang from kind of the necessity to organize what are oftentimes my jumbled thoughts. I thought this would really be a great opportunity to think a little more clearly about what I've been doing. And then also, I think like a conversation, a presentation is a really good opportunity to like bump into things that you didn't realize that you knew. So I love in a conversation when you say something that you didn't know that you knew. So that was kind of my other thought here. So my teaching is really important to my practice and to the work that I do. First off, at FAU, I teach a handful of different classes, and one of those is the Wheel Throwing 1 class. I enjoy teaching the beginners in this class because it necessitates my expressing some things that have otherwise become, I would say, like intuitive. And I don't mean to say that I'm overly skilled as a wheel thrower, but I am skilled enough that I don't have to think about it too much. So I always ask my students to imagine trying to teach someone how to drink a glass of water, right? And that I tell them that that's really as much as I can teach them, right? Really, it's about them practicing to learn how to do it. I also teach Wheel Throwing 2, which is also really great, fantastic. We get to talk about more advanced ideas, more advanced tools. I teach a special topics class called Molds and Fabrication. This class is very fascinating because it helps students think about how to create art in different ways. So within the visual arts and art history at FAU, we have two what we call fab labs. And these house tools like 3D printers. We have a CNC router, which is basically like a computer controlled cutting machine. We have a laser cutter, decal printer, basically newer technologies that help with making. And these are really fantastic because they help students with new ways of thinking and new ways of seeing. So teaching the class is really great for the students, but then it's actually pretty fantastic for me too, because I'm able to learn so much. I teach 3D design, which is really like an entry-level art class. And this class is also very interesting in the same way that the beginning wheel class or the wheel 1 class is, in that I have to really reflect upon ideas that I've held for a long time or that I think I like know. Excuse me. And then lastly, I teach our BFA seminar class. So in this class, we do websites, resumes, cover letters, and we talk more in depth about artistic practice and theory. This class is really exciting for me because I get to work with our top level students in the art department, and especially those that I might not otherwise get to interact with, such as the printmakers, the painters, the photographers, and the graphic designers. Okay, so random thought number 1, and I mean, as I was doing this, I was thinking like, well, these aren't really that random because I already wrote them down, right? Luckily, though, they're random enough that I'm like kind of forgetting what they are. So at least at this point, they're like semi-random, I would say. And so this first random thought is based on the idea of creativity, right? And for me, I think you often hear creativity talked alongside of artistic practice. And I mean, I kind of disagree with this idea, mostly because I think that human beings are creative, right? I just think that's what we do. And so I think there's just creativity in all of our endeavors. So pretty random, I think. Okay, so random thought number 2 is, what is the point of art? Or what is art? Right, and so going back to this idea that I teach these beginning level classes, I think these are the kind of questions that I'm often faced with and that I have to reflect upon. And so, like, what is art? I actually have no idea, right? And in some ways, I'm being facetious. I think in the end, the answer that often occurs is that art is this very personal thing and that it can be anything. And for me, that's not like an overly satisfactory answer, but I do think it holds a fair amount of truth. But what I think is so wonderful about this idea is that in the end, art can be anything, right? And I think for me, that's what's so wonderful about this thing that I'm involved in every day, is just that that myself, students, other artists you can just do anything you want to do. You know, and I think there's something so beautiful and like something so wonderful about that. So I think that's where part of my excitement comes from. Okay, so I do want to talk about some of my past research or work, however you want to think of it. And I think that will give us a better understanding of what I'm doing now. So I'm going to walk you through 3 projects, and these projects are kind of a sample out of work that I did for probably around 4 to 5 years. So I kind of focused on this one area for around 4 to 5 years, and these are a few of the projects that come out of them. And excuse me again. So the question that I kind of started with in this case was, how can the everyday be used as art? Right. At the time, I was having maybe difficulty finding some inspiration or subject to make work about. You know, and I started thinking like, well, geez, I like have a life, you know, and it's like I do stuff, you know, so I was wondering maybe how I could use that stuff as the impetus to make objects. You know, and the idea that I came up with was this idea of self-data. And it's important to note that at this time, those like wristbands were becoming really popular. The ones that like told you how many times your heart beat in a minute and then like how much you were sleeping. You know, at the time I remember thinking like, this is so pointless. Like, who cares how many times your heart beats or like how much oxygen is in your blood? You know what I mean? Like, it just didn't seem like very interesting. So my idea was maybe I could figure out a way to like get this data, except not so much about like biometrics and the idea of being human, but more about like culture and the ideas of being an individual. So what I started doing was I made these fairly detailed notebooks, and I did this for a few months, where as soon as I would wake up, I would write down what time it was. So I wake up, you know, I'd say like, okay, 9 a.m., woke up. 9:02, went to the restroom. 9:03, you know, and so I just did that all day. And then what I ended up doing is I went back through these notebooks and I kind of categorized all of those like behaviors or activities or whatever you want to call them. And then I color coded each of those categories. So the resulting artwork were these three panels or canvases, however you want to think of them. But basically, they're kind of a map of my daily life at this time. So each of these is the record of one day of my life. So I called this work Minute by Minute. And one of the other interesting aspects of this were these like little time signatures that I put on each tile. So basically like 1932 would have been 7:32 in the evening, right? So at 7:32 in the evening, I was doing whatever category yellow is. And what came out of this was this notion that really what I was doing is I was like creating a collection of behavior or actions, however you want to think of it, or time. And then that really got me thinking about this idea of an archive, right? So the next thing that I did was I took all of my possessions and I created this like numbering system. So I was really thinking about myself as like a museum. So I created this little numbering system. And then I went back and put a number on everything that I owned. So all my possessions got a number, you know, and the number had some significance. And then I photographed all of those objects. And then alongside that, I created this description sheet where I basically like wrote down all the information that I had about each of my possessions. So like I put them into categories. I tried to figure out when I got them, a description of them, etc. And this like part of the project actually became really interesting because I had to revisit so many like memories, which was really nice for the benefit of the nostalgia. I also created another notebook, and in this one I wrote all the objects and then wrote down every time that I used the object. So the work, I titled it Everything I Own, and the resulting artwork was a group of photographs. The one caveat is that all of the photographs started the same size. And then the idea was the more that object was used, the bigger that object's photograph became. So in the end, those photographs that were the largest were the objects that I used the most often. So then from there, you know, I don't really consider myself a ceramic artist, right? But I do tend to use clay and ceramic quite often. You know, and so I really enjoyed the photographs and I enjoyed all of that, but I missed using clay. So I wanted to kind of get back to this use of clay. And I was thinking how to use clay as part of this like archival idea, you know, and then I really started, what I realized was that, you know, much of what we know about historic cultures is through their ceramics, or at least some of what we know. And so you know, I realized then that like, wow, clay or ceramic as a material is already an archive. You know, so then the idea was like, how do I like get this idea of self or data into the clay? And what I ended up doing was I ended up making a series of these clay tiles. And I basically locked myself in a room for 5 days from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And during that time, I had a clock. I had a clock in there, and as soon as the clock struck 9 a.m., I punched into the, or excuse me, like stamped into the clay tile 9 o'clock and the date. And then when the clock went to 9:01, I put 9:01 and the date and 9:02. And so I did that for 8 hours for 5 days. So the resulting work was these 5 vitrines of these small clay tiles that in some ways, I think, kind of captured my existence for that time period. So this work I called Keeping Time. And in doing it, I did borrow more from the idea of museums where I was thinking about how butterflies and insects are displayed. And so I use these little pins to kind of display or pin in the small clay tiles. Okay, so random thought number 3. the importance of questions. And philosopher James Walsh asks, why are we certain that a question cannot itself be a disclosure? And so for me, this quote is so interesting, just because I find, questions are really exciting in that you can get in them and really be curious. I think more so than with an answer, right? And I do think with answers you get a certain amount of questions, right? But I think there's something so provocative about questions and the ability to really inquire. And for me, if I'm reading a text and there's a question, I always think like the writer is being so generous. It's like they're allowing you to kind of enter into this dialogue that they're having and create something yourself. So I really love this idea of like questions, the importance of questions, and they're disclosing a certain amount. Okay, random thought number 4. So, can the creation of artwork provide enough meaning in and of itself? So, this question kind of came about when I moved to Boca and to FAU. So I left where I was living, I moved here, and you can imagine my past work was, it was enjoyable, it was interesting, but it was also a little bit rigid, and it was like a bit too OCD, I think. And I really wanted to try to escape that situation. So when I came here, I really was just thinking like, is it okay for me just to like make some stuff, right? Do I have to be so worried about what it is or where it's going? And I was wanting to really just play with materials, play with color, and have some fun. And so I made this series of work where I did that, right? And I don't know. I mean, I think this idea of formalism as a way to escape the pressures of meaning, context, and subject is okay. I think it's okay to just make things. It's not overly satisfactory when students tell me that they just want to make stuff, right? I don't know if I accept that answer from them very often, unless they can talk through it well. But I think looking back at this work, I could start to talk more in depth about where I think it was coming from, and really what I think it is. But at the same time, I'm okay with it being what it is, right? I don't always need it to have a label of like, this is what I think this thing is. So, I mean, kind of along with that is this idea that process and material are enough. The creation of artwork less interested in attempting to create meaning as the world seems meaningful enough, right? And so if you saw the flyer for this talk, that's kind of where the ideas on the flyer came from, right? I think especially within the past few years, I have felt like the world is very meaningful, right? Especially when I like look at my news apps on my phone, I feel like, wow, so much meaning, or like so much going on, And I think for me, that has really brought up the importance of my making as an escape from needing the work to talk about maybe more recent issues, or I'm happy with it just being itself, and I'm happy as a maker to be able to utilize the work as a place to go to where I don't have to worry so much about other things that are happening. So, I think what that brings up and what this work kind of led to was me really thinking about the importance of material, especially with regards to clay. And I think when you look at this material or when you work with it all the time, again, it becomes like pretty normal. But I think then there's also the opportunity to step back from kind of what it is. And when you do that, it's just really weird. It's like such a weird material. You can like push on it, you can fire it, and it becomes like hard and kind of frozen. So I was really just thinking about like, what is this stuff and how can I think about it in a different way and interact with it in a different way. And so that led me to making videos, which was a nice difference. I started thinking about using images of a certain thing and questioning what an image is in some sense. And then also, I think the importance of this work for me, I ended up doing this exhibition. And so the importance of the work was really about allowing myself to follow a certain amount of intuition and just make things for the pleasure of working with the material. But then also the installation of the objects became just as much of an investigation, and I found that that process was so interesting in kind of, I don't want to say being creative, right? Because I already said I'm not supposed to do that, but being creative and being playful for sure. So Peter Dormer, who is a writer and art critic, he has this statement: the process of making, basically, the process of making allows the maker to understand more thoroughly and respond to what is happening. And I think one of the things that's so interesting about clay is it really is fairly temperamental, and I would say it has a certain mind of its own, where you do something to it and then it responds to that something. And so I've always thought that really this working with this material, or maybe any material, is a lot like a conversation, right? Where you do something and then it kind of answers that something, and it really becomes a dialogue that is really enjoyable when you kind of pay attention to that. So last summer, I did a residency in China, and going to a new place is obviously really stimulating. They have different tools and different materials. And so when I went there, I didn't really have a lot of expectations, but I did pretty quickly start to fall back onto ideas that I've used before, but then also allow myself to work, I think, maybe a little more loosely and a little more freely. Which was very helpful. So going there was actually quite helpful, even though I didn't like do anything completely new. It was really helpful to think about what I had done and start to approach that in some new ways. So what happened then in coming back, and so this work is probably the work that I've made in the last 6 months or so. What happened, I think, is I've realized that my work is maybe kind of in two places right now. It's in the first place where I'm interested in thinking more about this idea of clay as having the ability to capture, and then I'm also still, I think, making things as an escape, right? Where I'm okay with it being going in a direction that I don't exactly know, and it being about aesthetics and just the action of making. But in understanding this, in realizing that the work is kind of in between right now, I think I have a better idea of really where I want the work to go, and to simplify those ideas so that hopefully they are a little clearer. And so the one idea is like, yeah, this idea of formalism, right? And color and form. And then this other idea is really just clay having this really unique ability to not only capture something, but also then to kind of freeze that capture or to archive it. So I don't know how intelligible this talk is. I did practice it, and I thought like, oh man, I'm all over the place, and I'm always all over the place. So I thought I would try to talk a little bit about what I see as really important with regards to like making stuff and artistic practice. So the first thing, and then it's also important for me before I get started here, is to just talk about the idea that like, I think this situation, this like, why is art worthwhile? I think would be different for every artist, right? I think if you ask anyone, it's going to be a little bit different. But first for me is like the planning stage. And I think the planning stage is really so cool because it's so, as I already said, it's so limitless. This is your chance to really use imagination, and I think also to kind of move into territory that as an individual you haven't been in before, right? So for me, I'm not super good at like doing something completely new. I usually like use an old idea and then like tweak it a little bit, right? But even so, even that little tweak is so exciting to see what comes out of it. Oh shoot. Anyway, you can see here I skipped a slide accidentally, but I was also wanting to talk a little bit about scholarly research, right? And I think one thing you don't often get by looking at artwork is the understanding of kind of, you know, as artists, we are often reading about art, but about philosophy and about a lot of other things, and being inspired by those things. And so I think often this like scholarly research is isn't easy to discern in objects, but it is exciting and it is there often. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about was the process stages, you know, and so this is, again, this is that interaction with the materials. And as we said with regards to Peter Dormer, the ability to interact with the material, but then also to learn through that creation process, right? And I think this learning also involves a certain aspect of like meditation, right? Where I think, especially when you become more technically proficient, you don't have to think so much about like what you're doing and can get lost more in what's happening. Excuse me. And then lastly, I think the finished work, for me, the finished work is like not the most exciting thing, right? Like it is exciting to have an idea and then see it come to fruition, but also at that point, it's kind of over, right? Now, the one thing I think that finished work does allow is it allows for a certain amount of reflection, right? Especially this idea of really trying to understand what you're doing and what those objects express and can convey. I think there's something really kind of interesting in there. Um, and I think this is kind of an indefinite thing, right? I think often I'm looking back at artwork that I made 10 years ago, you know, and I'm still realizing things that I definitely didn't realize at the time. And then I think also the viewer's experience is really valuable in that you're able to first of all have social engagement, right? In a situation like this where you can sit down and talk about art and talk about ideas, but then also just trying to understand what the objects are from outside of your own viewpoint and how they're received and understood. I think it's pretty exciting. And then lastly, as was said by Karen at the beginning, you know, COVID happened and that kind of ended this ability to exhibit artwork. You know, and I found myself in a position where I wanted to exhibit, but I didn't have the ability because of the, you know, the social distancing. So what I decided to do is I thought, you know what, I'll just start a website that's kind of like an exhibition, and I'll have people show their work on there. So right now, this is the flyer you see is Distant Ceramics, and this is the second edition of Distant Ceramics. So the first edition, I chose a juror, I put out a flyer, and I think I received like just around 300 uh, applications. No, excuse me, works. I think there were like 97 applications. And what was so interesting is because it was online, there were over like 14 different countries represented, which I was very excited about. And then I was also able to talk to a friend of mine in the field who is well known, and he was the juror of the show. So basically the show was a website where I was able to put the people who were accepted into the show onto the website. And so even though I didn't get to exhibit anything, you know, I did feel like I was contributing something in being able to help other artists show their work. So right now is the second edition of the exhibition. And the applications aren't due until October 15th. So if you know anyone who makes ceramics or something that looks like ceramic, please let them know that they can apply. And that's it. That's everything I have. I want to first of all just thank the DOR, the Division of Research, for asking me to do this. You know, I know maybe it was a little bit short, so I apologize for that. But I do also want to thank you for coming, and especially if you made it this far. I think that's I appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thanks much, Thomas. Very interesting, very different. We do have a few questions, but just as a reminder, if you have any questions, if you hover your mouse in the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button there. And if you push that, you can type your question there and we will go through them one by one and have our presenter answer them. So I'm going to start, since we already have a few questions here, with the first question. Is there a difference between rules in industry art and personal art?
Is there a difference between rules in industry art and personal art? I mean, I think definitely there are differences, right? I mean, I think, you know, industry has so many other things to worry about, right? Like selling stuff. At least from my perspective, being a professor is really kind of nice because I don't have to worry about selling things, right? I am trying to make things, I am trying to exhibit things, but I'm allowed to actually follow my curiosity, where I don't have to worry about, you know, paying my bills. So there is a real flexibility in being a professor. Um, I don't know what, I mean, I guess I'm curious to know like what the questioner's idea of industry art is, right? I don't know if it's because I do ceramics, if they mean like utilitarian ceramics.
And I can tell that that's the extent of the question here, so I can interpret it any further for you.
Okay, so I mean, I do think there are differences, but I do think also as an artist, you have to also think about form in the same way that industrial artists have to think about it, right? You have to design the work. So I think there are definite overlaps for sure. But from my perspective, I really love not needing to worry about the sale of things, which I think really opens up a whole prospect of inquiry and exploration, which is why universities are amazing, right? It's why they're so fantastic, is we have the opportunity to explore avenues that might not otherwise be explorable.
Right, we're not truly a business. Coming back to your initial interest in what you're doing, one of the questions here is, what got you interested in clay making?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very nice question. I feel like that's such a, you know, it's just it seems like such a reasonable question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I could tell you like this long-winded story about how when I was a kid, you know, my mom, our gift was always like we were allowed to get coloring books if we were good. And then my brother was like the super cool older brother who did a lot of drawing and whatnot. And I think I'm doing the long-winded thing that I didn't think I would do. But basically, I've been interested in art for a long time. And when I went to university, my first professor in ceramics was a very, very intelligent and inspiring person. And I think his teaching, along with my interaction with the material, which I've tried to express my kind of curiosity about, really are the two things that kind of solidified my interest in ceramics. And I, just as a little side note, I did start as a person using the wheel and making pottery. And I really like pottery. I think there's something so wonderful about making these things and then being able to share them and being able to use them. That, you know, so that's kind of that's my love of clay.
And you're still teaching wheel throwing, so you're still doing part of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's see. Do you think you need an inspiration before you create, or can you just let your hands guide you and tile the pieces as emotions while you're creating it? Do you plan ahead? I mean, some of the things that you showed, you have 3D drawings before you make anything. With the clay making, maybe slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, I would say no, right? I think it's a very romantic idea to just say like, oh, you just let your whatever happen. But I mean, even that's an idea, right? Like you have to think about not thinking, you know? So I don't know how possible that is to just make something having no idea where it's going to go, right? So I think even at the smallest fraction, you're going to know like what you're doing and what you're aiming to do. But I do think there is, as I said with the Peter Dormer quote, you know, I do think there is this opportunity to to converse with the thing that you're making, right? It is giving you feedback that you're responding to and answering. And I do think creating and making things, that's part of like the magic of it. You know, it's not one-sided. And I think also interesting is we could go back to the question about industrial art, right? Where now a lot of artists, very well-known artists, actually don't make their work anymore, right? So they have a team of people, they put the ideas out, the team of people do the making, you know. And I think, first of all, that's really cool and interesting, but it's different, right? Because now they don't get that feedback from the artwork, right? So I think in some ways, while that seems like such a nice idea to not have to do like the hard work or the grunt work or whatever you want to call it, or the artwork maybe, I think making things is valuable in that process.
I think with any other profession, you're detaching yourself really from what it is you're doing if you have others doing the grunt work, right?
Mhm.
And that can be quite dangerous because I think you're missing out on that feedback that you're talking about. A very interesting question here. So the question is whether you've ever thought of moving abroad, and the individual asks about specifically France, where you have a lot of artists, and it seems like art is a lot more supported in Europe, particularly France. In your opinion on whether art is supported enough in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I have been lucky enough to live abroad, and you know, I don't know. I think it just doesn't matter that much to me. You know, I think I do feel supported actually, especially at FAU. You know, I feel like so free to follow my interests, and I feel very free to be curious. You know, very seldomly have I felt restrained here. You know, and so I think that freedom is very attractive. You know, but obviously, like moving to France would be fantastic, right? If someone offered me the chance to move to France and have the job that I have now in France, I would have a very difficult time saying no to that. You know, I mean, I do think in America, and this might just be who knows where this is coming from, but I don't know how much art is valued in the larger culture. But I don't know. I mean, that's not a thought that I often have where I think like, oh shoot, I wish more people liked ceramics or something. You know, like it doesn't really matter that much, especially as it's not what I need to worry about, right? Like I don't need to worry about selling things, you know, and I'm able to really like follow my ideas. So if you have a job in France that's really similar to this job and you're willing to offer it to me, then yes, I want to move to France. But if you don't, like, I'm pretty happy here at FAU.
I don't know, we want to keep you, Tom. But following up on influences from abroad, you mentioned you went to China, which of course is a very interesting environment, I would imagine, especially for ceramics and I would imagine also pottery. Can you state how your work or has changed in process or method as a result of your time spent in China?
I mean, no, I really can't. This was my second trip to China, you know, and I got that question often when I came back the first time. And I mean, for me, I don't feel overly influenced by places when I go there. You know, obviously, as I said, the materials are different and the tools are different and it is a different environment. But I think sometimes it is hard to realize how much where you are influences you until like after the fact, right? So what I showed kind of my work from before I moved to Boca and then when I moved to Boca, you know, and I didn't realize how dramatic the shift was until I started looking back at that work, actually doing this presentation. You know, I thought like, wow, I didn't realize that like my moving here might have influenced my like change in thought process so heavily. Which I'm not sure it did, right? I don't know how to like access that information, but in looking at like what I was making, I think there really is an opportunity to say like, obviously it changed you, you know? And I think the same is probably true of going to China. Um, I'm sure it had a large impact on me. Consciously though, I think it's sometimes very difficult to look at yourself and see those changes.
Mhm.
So you know, I like tea more because of it, right? Or like I'm better at using, I'm really, you know, I'm better at using chopsticks or whatever, right? But I don't know how much it changed my thought process or the art that I'm making.
Interesting. I'm going to go away a little bit from ceramics and move more towards pottery, if you don't mind for a minute. Do you teach in your classes the history of, I guess, pottery rather than ceramics? I mean, like, I believe like Aztecs or even, I believe Egyptian, Old Egypt. Do you teach the development, the progression, the historical progression of pottery and then maybe even ceramics in your classes?
I I very heavily teach ceramic history in my beginning wheel class or my wheel one class, and because you know it really provides such a fantastic opportunity to talk about diversity, right? It really provides the opportunity to say like this is what human beings do, right? We are these creative things that are animals or species or whatever we are, right? And throughout history, this material in some ways connects everyone, you know. So I really try my best and make a fairly large effort to teach students about the diversity of ceramics throughout the world historically, and then also the way that it's so similar, right? That these people who didn't have any contact were actually making objects that were very, very similar, um, just naturally, right?
Right, right. Very interesting. Okay, do you have any other tools other than your hands that you're using for in your clay making?
Yeah, I mean, I use all kinds of tools, right? I use my like, I don't know. I mean, I could be facetious, you know, be like, I use my brain or whatever. I mean, I use my hands. Sometimes I mean, I just use whatever. I don't know. I use like these things are called ribs. They like help you smooth the clay. I use newspaper so it doesn't stick to things. When I'm throwing, I have like a couple tools that I use. You know, as maybe you noticed from the images of like all my possessions, I try not to own too much stuff. So I am like, I limit my tool use. There are people in ceramics, and this is just like an interesting thing, but you can really tell a lot about a person by how many tools they have. You know, we have people show up and they have like boxes of tools, you know, and I was just thinking like, what are you doing with all that stuff? But no, I mean, I don't have a lot of tools. I don't have a lot of tools.
When you created that exhibit around the world, what guidelines do you look for in the ceramics? So, like you said, you had a judge, and what were the guidelines that they were looking for your exhibit?
I don't know, actually. I'm not really sure. I was considering my job to be as just like a person putting this thing together, right? I didn't want to influence. I don't know. I didn't think it would look great if I like put the thing together and then I was the juror also. So I really wanted to allow an outside influence to decide what they wanted the show to be. And I was just like the person kind of supporting everything, putting everything together. If you visit the website, though, which is distantceramics.com, you can see the show. And the person that I picked for the juror, Bruce Dennert, he is an amazing, amazing writer. Amazing writer. And he wrote like such a nice excerpt about the show and about the idea. So if you're interested in what the criteria are, obviously I have a different juror for this second edition. But if you wanted to read what Bruce commented on with regards to the first exhibition, you should check it out because it's very beautiful.
Okay, great. The next question, I believe you sort of already answered, since you mentioned that even with you moving to Boca, that changed what you were doing, how you were doing things. But the question here is, do you believe that the environment around you influences your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think this kind of goes back to that question about China. But I mean, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think like this is a conversation I would really love to have, and I do have, and I like having. But it's this idea of like how much. I mean, I don't want to say the word free will, but like what are we, right? Like, where do we come from with regards to like how we act, you know? And I think research shows that we're basically products of our environment.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know how possible it is to access that information though, right? Or how fully we can access it. I think you can obviously reflect on where you come from and understand things about yourself. But I don't know, the more I am a person, you know, the more I realize like it's we're just so complex, you know, and the reason we do things, I think, I don't know if we understand all of those reasons, right? But I do think it's such a fantastic conversation to have. I just, you know, so great question, right?
Well, and
No
maybe
fun, right?
even more specific to our current environment, has the current environment with the pandemic influenced your claim making?
I don't think so. You know, I mean, obviously, I'm I'm pretty alone most of the time. You know, as you can see from my practice, I'm not really a social artist. I don't involve the community in my work, except in my teaching. You know, I really like I really like the idea of like escaping to the studio. I like to put music on. I like to work in the studio. I like to be alone. You know, I like to drink coffee and just so the pandemic has maybe enabled me more than like hindered me. So like I can do what I like and not have to justify it quite as much.
Yeah. Now, if you were a writer, writers are known to have writer's block. Do you have that as a ceramic or clay making artist?
Yeah, I think I've probably had writer's block like always, you know. And I'm kidding, really, I'm kidding, but I just think like I mean, making art is very difficult. Um, Being a student was actually like kind of cool because the teacher tells you what to do, right? The teacher tells you like, here's what I want you to do, and that in some ways is so much easier than you know, having to come up with this stuff, you know. So I mean, I think the nice thing about being a teacher, though, is you don't have to worry so much about, at least I feel like I don't have to worry so much about what it is that I'm doing. As I've said, like I feel very free to kind of search for my curiosity, you know. And so when I get writer's block or whatever you call that, which I think happens, you know, it happens fairly often for me, that's really when I start making pottery. You know, I go back to making pottery when I don't know what to make sculpturally. You know, and what I find pottery does is, first of all, it's like super relaxing. I know when you first start out and you're first learning, it's maybe not quite as relaxing, but for me now, where I don't have to worry about like how to do it so much, I can just relax. But then it's really nice too because you can play with different surfaces and play with different stuff, you know, with the pottery, and it's not quite as valuable because it doesn't take as long to make, right? So I can make 10 cups and play around with those relatively quickly. So if I have writer's block or I have whatever we're calling this thing, then I actually really often make pottery as a way to just feel like I'm being productive.
Hmm, very interesting. I think I watched one of your presentations on glazes at some point. Do you want to talk a little bit about the differences in glazes that you can use? You're talking primarily pottery, I would imagine, but the glazes that you can make and use?
Uh, I mean, I don't really want to talk about glazes, but I will kind of talk about glazes. Let me say that. And why I think, and I talk about this all the time, but why I think ceramics is such an interesting field is it's very broad, right?
Mhm,
And a lot of ceramic artists kind of have a niche that they are interested in,
mhm,
you know. And so, you know, there's the like people that are interested in decoration, or the people that are interested in glazes, or the people that are interested in form or firing technique or whatever it is, you know. And so I think first of all, I think that's one of the things that makes ceramics so cool is there's so many possibilities. um, I mean, glaze is just another part of it, right? I'm not overly, I mean, I am interested in glaze. I do a fair amount of like exploration within that realm. um, but I don't know, you know, I don't know what to say about it.
it's not your focus area,
Yeah,
basically.
it's really, I mean, and this is why I'm not a great artist, is I'm like so interested in things that I have like a million things I'm doing. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do this, you know? And so sometimes it's like a bit much, where I think if I had more of a niche, maybe I would be able to talk about things more thoroughly, right? But I mean, I love glaze. I think it's weird and interesting and fun, and you know, whatever, I don't know. But it's not something that I'm like, I don't know. It's not
That's
my thing, I would
that's
say.
okay. That does get to our next question, though, and that's actually also related to what you already answered, basically coming back to China. So the question here again is, did your colors or your style change? And a little bit more specific question, I guess, after, during or after you came back from China.
I mean, specifically, yes. And I will say, so I went to China, and while I was there, I did make some functional stuff, right? And so again, I was using it as a way to just pass the time. Sometimes when I'm making sculpture too, they need to like set up or they need to dry a little bit before I can work on them more. So what I was doing was I had a series of sculptures going, and then I would make pottery. But also I started making pottery because in China, they have first of all, the city that I was in is very well known for ceramics historically. It's called Jingdezhen. It's where in the 16th century, it was the production place for ceramics that would be then sold to the world. So it's very much steeped in ceramics, but they actually still to this day have stores that you can go to, and all they have in the store is glaze, right? So it's like a glaze store. And not only that, there are like 4 of these stores right next to each other, right? And like, so you can go in and there's just glaze, right? And you can pick the glaze you want, and then they give you a container of it. So when I went, I was in there, and I actually don't use glaze that often on my sculpture. I usually spray paint them or paint them. But when I went into this glaze store, I wasn't even thinking about making pottery, but I saw this glaze and I thought like, I have to use this, it's unbelievable. So I did use it. And then when I came home, I started doing some research on like how to create that color. And I mean, strangely, it was like this neon green, so when I came home, then I've been like over the past, it's been, I don't know how long it's been now. It seems like it hasn't been that long, but I think it's been a long time. But in the interim, I've been like working on trying to figure out how to make this neon green glaze. So this is the one that I have formulated so far. But the one that is from China is on a different piece that I don't have here. But it is like so beautiful. So that is something that's kind of, when I was in China, that really like this glaze. Very cool.
Who are the customers of these glaze shops in China?
Well, they still have a fairly large industry. They
Uh-huh.
still have a fairly large industry. And now Jingdezhen has become very well known as like a ceramic refuge. So people will go there from all over the world, artists especially, and they'll go there, and there's still such a large foundation of people doing ceramics. So designers go there, and people will make their work for them. You can go there and do a residency or work in a workshop. Um, from the numbers that I've heard, Jingdezhen is like 1.5 million people. So it's in China, it's like a pretty small city. But within that 1.5 million, they say that like 1/6 of the population is still involved in ceramics in some way. So even when you go for a bike ride or you're walking down the street, there are like kiln shops, there are tool shops. It's really, if you're a ceramic person, it is very, very cool.
Yeah, it's like a fairy tale land for anybody in ceramics. All right, I think we have time for one more question. And this is related to a specific artist, and I don't know if you know him. So the question is, are you familiar with the ceramics and digital media of artist Alan Resnick? And if so, what do you make of it?
I don't know. I mean, I could Google it really quickly. I don't know Ellen Resnick, but let me see. Hopefully I spelled the name right. See, ceramics. Sorry about this. I think I'm not seeing it. I will write the name down. Did they spell the name
We
right?
can address the question offline, Tom, and then post it on our website, so you
Okay,
can have credit.
perfect. Yeah. Can you tell me the name again? Ellen?
Alan Resnick, Resnick.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Great. All right. So with that, we're pretty much out of time. So thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Definitely very different from our normal scientific talks here that we often have, in the majority. So I really appreciate you taking your time speaking with us about art and your ceramics. Very different perspectives. So Thanks again. And we'll send you the remaining questions to answer. We will post those on our website together with a recording if anybody would like to watch the presentation offline. Thanks so
Perfect.
much. Have a
Thank
great
you
day.
very much, Karen.
Bye.